Captain Joe Marlin was a man of the sea. He lived for the open water, the salty breeze, and the solitude that came with sailing alone. His 40-foot sailboat, the Sea Siren, was more than just a vessel. It was his sanctuary. After a decade of working as a charter boat captain, ferrying tourists around the Gulf of Mexico, Joe had finally saved enough to take a year off. This was his time, his chance to explore the less traveled waters of the Caribbean, to fish, to dive, and to find peace away from the crowds. For weeks, Joe had sailed from one island to another, each more remote than the last. He'd become accustomed to the rhythm of life at sea, the early mornings, the long stretches of water, and the occasional island stop to restock supplies. It was on one of these days, under a blazing sun with the wind at his back, that Joe spotted something unusual on the horizon. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the light playing on the water. But as he drew closer, he realized it was an island. Not marked on any of his charts, this small spit of land was barely more than a large sandbar with a few scraggly trees and some rocky outcrops. But what caught Joe's eye wasn't the island itself. It was the movement on the shore. Joe brought the Sea Siren closer. His curiosity piqued. As he neared the island, he saw a man standing on the beach, waving his arms wildly. The man was thin, his clothes tattered, his hair and beard long and unkempt. Joe's first thought was that he must be a castaway, someone who'd been shipwrecked and stranded for God knows how long. Joe anchored the boat a safe distance from the shore and took the dinghy to land. As he approached, the man staggered forward, tears in his eyes. "Thank you. Oh, thank you," the man cried, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I thought I'd never see another soul again." Joe hopped out of the dinghy and helped the man to his feet. He was frail, barely able to stand, and his skin was sunburned and blistered. "Easy now," Joe said, guiding him to sit on a rock. "How long have you been here?" I don't know," the man stammered, clutching at Joe's arm as if afraid he might disappear. "Years, I think. It's been so long. I lost track of time." Joe frowned. "What happened? How did you end up here?" The man took a deep breath and began to tell his story. His name was Henry, and he'd been a crewman on a small cargo ship that had gone down in a storm. He was the only survivor, washed ashore on this island with nothing but the clothes on his back. He tried to build a raft, but every attempt had failed. Over time, he'd given up hope of rescue, resigned to his fate on this desolate patch of sand. Joe listened carefully, his heart heavy with sympathy. He couldn't imagine the torment of being stranded for years, with no company but the sea and the sky. "You're lucky I found you," Joe said. "I'll get you back to civilization. There's a small town on the next island, a day's sail from here. We'll get you cleaned up, fed, and on your way home." Henry looked up at Joe, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "I thought I was going to die here." Joe smiled and patted him on the back. "Don't mention it. Let's get you off this island." With Henry safely aboard the Sea Siren, Joe set about making him comfortable. He gave him water, food, and clean clothes. As Henry devoured the meal, Joe couldn't help but notice how ravenous the man was, as if he hadn't eaten properly in a long time. While Henry rested in the cabin, Joe returned to the island to gather a few things. Perhaps there was something useful Henry had left behind. As he explored the small stretch of land, Joe began to notice things that didn't quite add up. First, there was the shelter. It was crude, but sturdy, built from driftwood and palm fronds. But it was the tools inside that caught Joe's attention. A knife, well kept and sharp. A spear fashioned from a long branch and a piece of metal. These weren't the makeshift tools of a desperate castaway. They were deliberate, crafted with skill and care. Then there was the garden. It was small, just a few rows of plants, but they were thriving. Tomatoes, beans, and a few herbs grew in neat rows, tended with obvious attention. Joe knelt down, touching the soil. It was moist, recently watered. Joe's unease grew. How had Henry survived all these years? The man claimed to be helpless, stranded with nothing, yet he had a knife, a spear, and a garden. Joe scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something else. Footprints. They were fresh, and there were more of them than there should be. Not just Henry's, but others. Someone else had been here recently. Maybe even more than one person. A chill ran down Joe's spine. He stood up, scanning the horizon, suddenly feeling exposed. There was something wrong here, something Henry hadn't told him. Returning to the boat, Joe found Henry dozing in the cabin. The man looked peaceful, but Joe's mind was racing. He quietly locked the cabin door from the outside, ensuring Henry couldn't leave without his knowledge. Joe went to the cockpit and pulled out his satellite phone. He needed advice, someone to tell him what to do. He dialed his friend and fellow sailor, Captain Laura, who was currently docked in the Bahamas. "Laura, it's Joe. I've got a situation," he said when she picked up. "What's up, Joe? You sound tense." Joe explained everything. Finding Henry, the island, the tools, the garden, the footprints. Laura listened in silence, and when he was done, she spoke carefully. "Joe, this doesn't sound right. If this guy's been stranded for years, how is he so well prepared? Why hasn't he left the island? And those footprints, they mean someone else is out there." "I know," Joe said, glancing nervously at the locked cabin. "I don't trust him, Laura. But I can't just leave him here." "No, you can't. But you need to be careful. If he's dangerous, you're alone out there." "What do I do?" Laura paused, then spoke slowly. "You could sail to the next island, get him help, and let the authorities handle it. Or you could try to get more information out of him. Find out what's really going on. Whatever you do, don't let your guard down." Joe thanked her and hung up. He knew she was right. Something was off about Henry, and Joe needed to find out what. But how? Joe decided to confront Henry, but cautiously. He unlocked the cabin door and went inside, finding Henry awake and looking out the small porthole. "Feeling better?" Joe asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes, much. Thank you again, Joe. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Joe sat down across from him, studying the man's face. "Henry, I went back to the island to see if there was anything you wanted to bring with you." Henry's face remained calm, but Joe saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps. "Oh, I didn't leave much behind," Henry said, his voice steady. "Really?" "Because I found a few things that surprised me. Like the knife, and the spear, and the garden. You've been taking care of yourself pretty well?" Henry looked away, his hands trembling slightly. I had to survive. I couldn't just give up." "I understand," Joe said, leaning forward. "But what about the footprints? There were more than just yours on that island." Henry's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "Footprints? What are you talking about?" Joe felt a surge of adrenaline. He'd hit a nerve. "Don't lie to me, Henry. Who else has been on that island? And don't tell me you've been alone all these years. I know something's not right." For a moment, Henry said nothing. Then his expression hardened, and the man who had seemed so desperate and pitiful moments ago suddenly looked different, more dangerous. "You're right," Henry said quietly. I haven't been alone. But you have no idea what you've stumbled into, Joe. You should have left when you had the chance. Joe's heart pounded as he realized the gravity of his situation. Henry was not just a helpless castaway. He was hiding something far more sinister. Tell me what's going on, Henry, Joe demanded, keeping his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Henry sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his secrets had finally become too much to bear. I didn't want to involve you in this. The island isn't just some deserted patch of land, Joe. It's a hideout, a base for something much darker. Joe's pulse quickened. What do you mean, a hideout? Who else has been on that island? Henry hesitated, glancing at the locked cabin door, as if weighing his options. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. I wasn't stranded by accident, Joe. I'm part of a group. Well, I was part of it. We were smugglers, running illegal cargo through the Caribbean. Drugs, weapons, you name it. That island was our drop point, our safe house. Joe felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected something was off, but he hadn't expected this. So what happened? Why are you alone now? Henry's eyes darkened. Things went south. There was a betrayal within the group, and a deal went bad. I was the fall guy. They left me on that island to die, told me if I ever left or tried to contact anyone, they'd hunt me down and kill me. Joe sat back, trying to process this new information. He had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And those footprints? Who else has been on the island recently? Henry's face tightened. They've come back a few times, checking on the place, making sure I'm still stuck there. Sometimes they leave supplies, taunting me, reminding me I'm a dead man if I leave. But they don't know you're here, Joe. They don't know you've found me. Joe swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. He was caught in the middle of a smuggling operation, and now his life was at risk. We need to get out of here, Henry. We need to leave before they come back. Henry shook his head. It's not that simple. If we try to leave, they'll see us. They have lookouts, other islands with people watching. If we don't play this smart, they'll hunt us down before we can make it to safety. Joe clenched his fists, trying to think clearly. So what do? We can't stay here forever. Henry looked at him, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. I have a plan, but it's risky, and it's going to take both of us to pull it off. Over the next few hours, Henry laid out his plan, and Joe listened intently, his mind racing with the implications. The plan was simple in theory, but would require precision and timing to execute successfully. There's an old smuggler's tunnel on the island, Henry explained. It leads to the other side, where there's a hidden cove. It's where they used to stash the boats. If we can make it through the tunnel without being seen, we can take one of the boats and sail out before they realize we're gone. Joe nodded, as if he saw the logic in the plan, but wondered why Henry wouldn't have tried to escape if there were boats on the island. And what if they see us? What if the tunnel is compromised? He decided to go along with the plan for now to buy more time to think. Henry looked grim. Then we're dead. But it's our best shot. If we stay here, eventually they'll come back, and they won't let you leave alive. You know too much now. Joe had always been a man who trusted his instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling him that time was running out and he needed to do something, anything. He knew something wasn't right, but needed Henry's knowledge of the island and the operation to have any chance of surviving. Let's do it, Joe said, his voice firm. We'll go tonight, under the cover of darkness. Henry nodded, and for the first time since Joe had found him, He looked determined, like a man who had a chance at redemption. Night fell quickly, the sky darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. Joe and Henry prepared in silence, though the tension was palpable. Joe kept replaying Henry's story in his mind, trying to fit the pieces together. It seemed impossible that a man would remain on the island willingly for years, yet here Henry was, alive and waiting for an opportunity. As the hours passed, Henry's demeanor shifted. He grew restless, pacing the small cabin on the sea siren, his eyes darting to the door every few minutes. Joe could see the gears turning in Henry's mind, and he knew a question was coming. "Joe," Henry finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. There's no boat on the island. If there was, I would have tried to escape long ago." Joe looked at him, his expression neutral. "I figured as much." "So what's your plan, Henry? Why did you lie? You want me to take you off this island, risk getting caught by your smuggler friends, and then what? We get gunned down in the middle of the ocean?" Henry stopped pacing and faced Joe, his eyes pleading. "I've been a prisoner here for years, Joe. They left me here to rot, as a warning to anyone who might cross them. I never thought I'd get a chance to leave. But now you're here. We can escape together." "Escape to where?" Joe asked, leaning against the wall. "You think they won't come after us? You said it yourself. They have lookouts. The moment we leave, they'll know." Henry's face hardened, desperation mingling with fear. "I know it's risky, but what choice do we have? If we stay here, they'll eventually come back, and when they find out you've discovered me, they won't let you go. You're a loose end, Joe." Joe remained silent, weighing the options. He knew Henry was right, but the thought of sailing into almost certain danger made his stomach churn. Yet the alternative was no better. If the smugglers returned and found him on the island, he'd be in just as much trouble, if not more. "What's the plan, then?" Joe asked, his voice steady, but his mind still racing. Henry sighed, rubbing his hands together as he spoke. "We sail at night, keep close to the shore, and head for the nearest inhabited island. From there, we can get lost in the crowd. Maybe find a way to alert the authorities without tipping off the smugglers. It's a long shot, but it's better than sitting here, waiting to die." Joe considered Henry's words. The plan was full of holes, but it was the only option they had. He knew he couldn't just leave Henry here, no matter how dangerous the man might be. But he also couldn't ignore the possibility that Henry might be leading him into a trap. "You realize," Joe said slowly, "that if we try this and they catch us, they'll kill us both." Henry nodded, his eyes locking onto Joe's. "I know. But at least we'll have a fighting chance. Please, Joe. I can't do this without you." Joe sat in the cabin long after Henry had gone to bed, staring out the small porthole into the dark ocean. The plan was risky, perhaps even suicidal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed Henry a chance at redemption, or at least at survival. The idea of leaving him to die on that island felt wrong, even if Joe couldn't fully trust him. Morning came, and with it, a new resolve. Joe knew what he had to do, even if it meant putting his own life on the line. He found Henry on the deck, staring out at the horizon, his expression unreadable. "We'll do it," Joe said, standing beside him. "We'll try to escape. But if I get any sense that you're leading me into a trap, I won't hesitate to cut you loose. Understood?" Henry nodded, relief washing over his face. "Understood. I won't betray you, Joe. I just want to get off this island." They spent the day preparing for the journey, gathering supplies and mapping out their route. Joe took extra care to ensure the sea siren was ready for a quick and stealthy departure. The plan was to sail as close to the shore as possible, using the cover of darkness to avoid detection. As night fell, they cast off, the sea siren gliding silently through the water. Henry stood at the bow, scanning the horizon for any signs of the smugglers, while Joe manned the helm, his eyes never leaving the instruments. For hours they sailed in silence, the tension between them growing with every passing minute. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but the darkness and the thick jungle lining the shore obscured any potential threats. Finally, just as dawn began to break, they spotted the outline of another island on the horizon. It was larger, with signs of habitation, lights, buildings, and the faint sound of distant voices. "There it is," Henry said, his voice tinged with both hope and fear. "That's our way out." Joe nodded, but his focus was on the water ahead. They were in open territory now, and any wrong move could draw attention. He adjusted their course, aiming for a small cove that looked like it would provide good cover while they figured out their next steps. As they approached the cove, Joe's heart pounded in his chest. They were almost there, almost safe. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A flash of light in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of an engine. "Henry, get down," Joe shouted, yanking the throttle back and steering the boat into the cove as fast as he could. Henry dropped to the deck, his face pale as he realized what was happening. The smugglers had found them. The boat roared to life, cutting through the water as Joe tried to maneuver into the cove, but it was too late. The smugglers' boat was already closing in, and Joe could see the men on board, armed and ready. "We're not going to make it," Henry muttered, panic creeping into his voice. "Stay calm," Joe ordered, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. "We're not dead yet." The smugglers' boat pulled alongside them, and Joe could see the cold, hard eyes of the men who had come to kill them. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his face, stepped to the edge of the boat, a gun in his hand. "End of the line, boys," the man called out, his voice dripping with menace. "You shouldn't have tried to run." Joe's mind raced. They were outgunned and outnumbered, with no way to outrun the smugglers. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Not after coming this far. "Listen to me," Joe said quietly to Henry, his eyes never leaving the men on the other boat. "I'm going to try something. When I give the signal, jump overboard and swim to shore. Hide in the jungle. If you get away, find someone, anyone, and get help." Henry looked at Joe, fear and uncertainty written all over his face. "What about you?" "I'll buy you as much time as I can. I won't be far behind you," Joe replied, his voice steady. "Just go." Before Henry could protest, Joe sprang into action. He grabbed the nearest object, a flare gun, and fired it at the smuggler's boat. The flare shot through the air, hitting one of the men in the chest and igniting in a burst of light and fire. Chaos erupted. The men on the smuggler's boat scrambled to put out the flames, giving Joe the momentary distraction he needed. He shouted at Henry, "Now! Go!" Henry hesitated for a split second, then did as Joe said, diving overboard and disappearing beneath the waves. Joe turned back to the smugglers, who had regained their composure and were now training their guns on him. He fired the flare gun again, aiming for the fuel tank on the smuggler's boat, but this time he missed. The flare sailed harmlessly into the water and the men closed in. Joe knew he was out of options. He raised his hands in surrender, hoping to buy Henry a few more seconds to escape. "Smart move," the leader said, smirking as he leveled his gun at Joe. "Too bad it won't save you." Joe braced himself, ready for the inevitable, when suddenly there was a loud explosion from the smuggler's boat. The fuel tank had ignited after all, and the boat was engulfed in flames. The men screamed in panic, diving overboard as the boat began to sink. Joe didn't wait to see what happened next. He dove into the water, swimming as fast as he could toward the shore. He reached the beach, gasping for breath, and pulled himself onto the sand. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, then looked around, frantically, for Henry. There was no sign of him, but Joe could only hope he had made it to safety. The sound of sirens in the distance brought Joe back to reality. He stumbled to his feet and headed into the jungle, knowing that his only chance was to find help and get out of there before the smugglers regrouped. Joe spent the next few hours navigating through the dense jungle, every sound making him jump. He couldn't shake the fear that the smugglers were still out there, hunting him down. But he pressed on, driven by the need to survive and the hope that Henry had made it out alive. Eventually, he reached a small village on the other side of the island. The people there were shocked to see him, his clothes torn and his body bruised from the ordeal. Joe quickly explained what had happened, and the villagers, sympathetic to his plight, helped him contact the local authorities. By the time the police arrived, Joe was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He told them everything about the island, the smugglers, and Henry. The authorities promised to search for Henry and bring the smugglers to justice, but Joe knew it would be a long and difficult process. Days passed, and Joe remained in the village, waiting for news. He learned that the smugglers' operation had been much larger than anyone had realized, with connections to criminal organizations across the Caribbean. The authorities had launched a full-scale investigation, and arrests were being made, but there was no sign of Henry. As the days turned into weeks, Joe began to lose hope. He couldn't stop thinking about Henry, whether he had made it out of the jungle or if he had been captured or worse. The uncertainty weighed heavily on him, and he found himself questioning his decision to help Henry in the first place. But then, one morning, a local fisherman came to Joe with news. A man matching Henry's description had been found by a rescue team on the other side of the island. He was injured, but alive, and he had been taken to a hospital for treatment. Joe felt a surge of relief and guilt all at once. He had helped Henry escape, but at what cost? The man had been part of a criminal organization, and while he had been betrayed and left to die, he had still committed crimes. Joe wondered if he had done the right thing, or if he had merely prolonged the inevitable. Joe eventually returned to his boat and sailed away from the island, leaving behind the events that had changed his life forever. But the questions lingered, haunting him in the quiet moments at sea. He had been faced with a difficult choice, whether to trust a man with a dark past and risk his own life to help him escape, or to leave him behind and save himself. In the end, Joe had chosen to believe in redemption, to give Henry a second chance. But that choice had come with consequences, ones that Joe would have to live with for the rest of his life. As he sailed into the horizon, Joe couldn't help but wonder, what would someone else have done? Was he nuts? Take a huge risk to help a stranded criminal? In the end, Joe realized there were no easy answers. The sea, like life, was unpredictable and dangerous, and sometimes all you could do was make a choice and hope it was the right one. And as the sun set on the endless ocean, Joe knew that he would carry the weight of that choice with him for the rest of his days.